If you're not playing a damage over time build yet, Season 2 is going to change that. If you want to have the best build, it's gonna be damage over time. And the whole reason why are all of these changes to the damage calculation, okay? I went over it in another video, exactly what the changes to the calculation were, and I said that damage over time builds are going to benefit greatly from this, but still, not everyone is understanding it, and I think it's because damage over time calculation is so different than a normal damage calculation in Diablo 4. Really, it's hard to wrap your head around unless you visualize it. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I've got handy dandy Excel up so we can visualize it all together. First, we're going to start with normal damage, right? So this is a normal damage build. This is your physical damage, anything that can crit. Anything besides damage over time has the same calculation for normal damage, which has essentially a multiplicative damage boost, which is your base damage. You know, whatever you increase your base damage by will multiplicatively increase the rest of your damage. We know vulnerable, crit damage, and overpower are now multiplicative. Okay? And then we have our additive, which here I've broken down additive further so you can kind of see an example of what the different types of additive damages are for normal damage builds. When added all together, these total around 400 additive damage, and your damage output was previously 3,750 under the old calculations of vulnerable and crit. Under the new calculations, this vulnerable and this crit, all of your multiplicatives are capped. Any multiplicative that you can have on a normal damage build are capped through the new changes. So your vulnerable damage, you can only get 20. Critical damage, you can only get 50, which you start with at your base. So you really don't want much more than this. But if all else is the same, so we have the same stats before as we do after, the second that the new patch hits, this is going to be your damage, and it will be a 63% decrease in damage. Now, I already showed this. What I didn't show is what a damage over time change will look like. This is very important. So, damage over time also has a multiplicative of the base damage and vulnerable damage. Critical damage never has been and will not be in the future a multiplicative or any damage type for damage over time builds. They cannot crit, therefore critical damage does nothing. Same with overpower, all right? But what people don't know are all of these other mechanics that go into the calculation for damage over time, which have secret multiplicative damage boosts, such as core skill being a multiplicative damage skill. Also, skill type damage, such as cutthroat and marksman, are also multiplicative damage boosts. In addition to that, in the additive category, there are actually special additives that are giving a 2 times additive boost to damage over time, such as percent damage. The reason this works is because the percent damage is increasing the damage of your skill, and then it's also being applied as your additive. So it's being added twice into the additive formula. So here is what a damage over time calculation looked like before the changes. You did 4,500. After the changes, you will do 3,000 with no differences. So you didn't change anything. You still kept all this vulnerable damage that you had before because it was working for you, but now it's not. This alone is half the decrease that a normal damage build has seen. And this is before anything in the Paragon, any new uniques, anything like that. So all of those will be added on to this equivalent normal damage to damage over time. So Paragon, uniques, that's all separate. We're just looking at the damage calculation that's being done. Okay, this is what it looks like if you don't change anything. But what if we optimized more for the new season? So we know that things are changing. Let's optimize a bit. All right, so here's where we were at. We had a 63% damage decrease, but we know now that overpower is going to be multiplicative. So before we didn't really use overpower. Now we're going to add 50 to overpower, but it's got to come from somewhere. So we're going to take it out of our crit damage, which now is only additive. So we're taking 50 out of our crit and putting it into our overpower. Now, this is granted that you are actually being able to proc overpower. So you're only going to get this multiplicative damage boost when overpower procs, but say you do, your damage now goes back up to around 1900. It's an increase, about 40% from your damage after all the changes, but it's still about half the damage you were doing before the changes. Now, Blizzard has said that they're going to adjust monster levels to adjust for this, right? So that's great. So you're probably going to feel like you were doing the same damage, which means all of the boss health is going to be maybe around 50% less. But what does that mean for damage over time builds? Well, look at where we're able to get our damage to in damage over time. Damage over time builds are not going to want vulnerable damage anymore. But we have so many other unlimited multiplicative buckets that don't have this cap, this artificial cap that basically Blizzard has instated for normal type damage. Damage over time builds can completely ignore it. So guess what? We're taking that 180 extra vulnerable damage that we had that was only getting added, and we're just going to redistribute it. We're going to put it into core skill, which works as a multiplicative. We're going to put it into skill type damage, which is also a multiplicative, and say we can't put all of it in these two buckets, and we've got to go with a % damage, which is a double additive. We have a lot more options. Any damage over time build has so many more options to redistribute the damage from vulnerable that they were using before. So as a result, we're able to increase our damage by nearly a third of where it was right when things change, and it's only an 8% decrease from previous amounts. So if mob health and boss health are now going to be about 50% lower because we're scaling off this normal damage, the damage over time builds are just going to shred. They're going to feel nearly twice as strong as before, and Poison Rogue was already, I think, the strongest build in the game. So, like I said, if you're not playing a damage over time build yet, you're going to want to for Season 2. Damage over time is going to be the king unless they change this formula. The math doesn't lie. It's not a take. It's not my opinion. It's the math. It's the facts. So I hope you guys like this. I hope this helps get my point across. And really, I'm going to be going through and updating all of my builds and taking out the vulnerable damage and really just adding in some of these other skill damages, as well as the Paragon boards. So the Paragon boards are changing, and I'm having a lot of fun tweaking them, and I will have all of those up for you guys shortly. But I just wanted to get this out there so you guys can start preparing for your damage over time builds for Season 2. I'll see you in the next one. Later.